strike in Mosul killed war against ISIS. This was the March 17th incident, 500-pound bomb. And so it's in truthdig.com, but it looks like it's from Thomas Gibbons Neff of the Washington Post, whom I don't trust the Washington Post because, as been reported on when I've been as an aggressive progressive and the Jimmy Dore Show, Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, has received $600 million from the CIA. And the Washington Post this is the same Washington Post that said Saddam had weapons of mass destruction in 2003 and basically has been a trumpet for the corporate war machine. There was also another article that came out in truthdig.com on March 30th about how the mainstream media soft-pedaled the Mosul airstrike headlines. There was a report from Ben Norton, from the Fairness in Reporting organization that here's fairness and accuracy in reporting. This is what he wrote on March 30th. If you read the headlines of major corporate media outlets, you'd think hundreds of Iraqi civilians coincidentally died in the same location that just so happened to be hit by the U.S. airstrike. And he analyzed numerous mainstream media headlines about the incident, finding that ABC News, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and some foreign publications all used watered-down headlines. The latest whitewashed titles are remarkably reminiscent of those composed to cover up a previous high-profile U.S. massacre of civilians, Norton continues, noting that headlines are of extreme importance because they are often the only piece of report that Americans read. The new news agencies know this now in this day and age of people getting all their news online. They'll just put the big title that says a certain thing, and they know most people aren't going to read all the way to the bottom to figure that out. Norton also says that defenders of corporate media might argue that news outlets had to craft carefully worded headlines as the U.S. government was still investigating the attack. But again, this simply reflects media's deference to power. If the government says something, there are countless journalists waiting in line to obediently echo it. Corporate media have a long, tried and true history of acting as stenographers to power, which that was said, and there's a clip on that of U.S. reviewing airstrike that corresponds to the site where 200 Iraqis allegedly died. All right, so they don't have the reports. That's what ABC is going to say, but it's all watered down. Now, if you go into the report that the Pentagon just came out, first of all, here's two things you're never going to see on one of these reports that the mainstream media is going to cover. You're never going to see photos and video of children that we have killed or any innocent civilians. You're never going to see footage of that. You'll see it when a so-called terrorist does it, when a terrorist does it, or there's a Assad does, a person like Assad does it, then we'll see the videos of that happening. We'll see the videos and the footage of the results of civilians dying from terrorist attacks against anyone in the West. But when we do this and kill civilians, there's no photos or video that comes out showing the civilians, mainly the women and children that we've killed. You'll never see that. You'll never see that. And according to this, the blast killed 2 Islamic State snipers and 105 civilians, which is horrifying. They also say there's 6 additional civilians that were killed, but they couldn't quote, they had insufficient evidence to determine their status or whereabouts. Kind of sounds like the person was completely blown to bits and they couldn't even determine what happened. In days after the strike, some reports said that more than 200 bodies were pulled from the rubble. It's the single deadliest civilian casualty incident in the nearly 3-year-old air campaign against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Following the public outcry from the strike, the U.S.-led coalition sharply decreased the number of sorties over Mosul in April, according to data analyzed by not-for-profit monitoring group Air Wars. So also in addition to this, now that there's two conflicting reports. The Pentagon is saying that ISIS takes these civilians and puts them in there as human shields to jack up the numbers. And there's reports now that say that the investigation said the mass of people killed in the strike had been invited to take shelter on the building's lower floors by a neighbor. The Islamic State also warned them to leave, according to locals interviewed during the investigation. The locals are saying the Islamic State told them to leave. That account is at odds with what the U.S.-led coalition's top officer suggested 11 days after the strike during a Pentagon press briefing at the time. The U.S. Army General Stephen Townsend said that it appeared that the civilians were herded there by the Islamic State and were being used as shields. Yeah, that's always our convenient thing. When we blow up and kill civilians, it's always the Islamic State is using human shields. Now, the Islamic State might do stuff like that, which is horrifying, but the fact that remains is that we have been blowing up in civilian populated areas. We've been doing this for a long time. And when this comes out, when this report comes out, it's always just from the Pentagon, and there's no, as I said, there's no photos or video of civilians we've killed. You never hear from an activist group or a non-for-profit organizations that they're with people on the ground. It's always just Pentagon reports, and we just take the Pentagon at face value. It must be true. And so it's pretty brutal, the size of this thing. And this, I'll tell you why I like what TruthDig is doing is because they're talking about what Amnesty International said, and they called on the U.S.-led coalition to desist from using explosive weapons with wide area effects, including artillery and mortars in crowded residential areas, as the battle for Mosul continues into its final stages. While we welcome the U.S. investigation into the Jadida airstrike, we are curious to know whether any lessons were learned and what steps were taken to ensure such horrors do not occur again in the statement. There's an estimated 200,000 civilians remaining in an area that is roughly 4 square miles. And this is the thing that I'm, really tired of, is the hypocrisy. What happened in Manchester at the Ariana Grande concert is horrifying. It's awful. And there's kids going to that concert, and somebody just went in there and killed a bunch of innocent civilians at a concert. That's awful. But how is it any different from our airstrikes? Because the terrorists doing it feel justified in their actions, just like, the U.S. and the military feels justified in their actions. And I was arguing with somebody online who was, I think, a Marine or something like that, who was like, it's a holy war and they started this. And really, they started this? 9/11, they started this? We've been interfering with the Middle East for 4+ decades because of oil. And we have been in a nonstop state of war for the last 16 years since 9/11. We have been, Afghanistan is America's longest war, okay? We have spent trillions, that's with the T, trillions of dollars fighting this global war on terror. You would think after 16 years and trillions of dollars, we would have won. Terrorism would be over. Well, guess what? This kind of stuff just creates more terrorists. We're not making the world safer. We're not making the world safer at all. Julian Assange posted on Twitter that the MI5 and MI6, which is England's, basically their versions of like the CIA, helped create the environment that led to the Manchester bombing. Julian Assange said that on Twitter. I was like, wow. So this is what we just do. We just go out and blow up civilians in the Middle East because we need their oil, and we do this regime change that doesn't work. We get in bed with insane military leaders. We backed the Shah of Iran, who did torture, was an awful, awful dictator because we needed their oil. Then when the Ayatollah came in and said, we're done helping out America, then we backed Saddam in the Iraq-Iran war. We were backing the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s. The Mujahideen later became the Taliban. And then we go against Saddam when, he wanted to get off the petrodollar. So it's awful. when civilians are blown up and killed by anybody, it's horrible. We can't sit here and take the moral high ground in America. Excuse me. And this is the thing. The U.S. coalition has acknowledged killing 352 civilians during the 3-year-old air campaign over Iraq and Syria. That figure, according to Air Wars, is extremely conservative. The UK-based group estimates that U.S.-led airstrikes have killed more than 3,000 civilians in both countries. That's a pretty big difference. And what is the gain of this Air Wars company? How are their numbers so drastically off of the United States military? What is their motive if they're lying? If this non-for-profit group Air Wars is like fabricating numbers and pumping up the numbers, what do they get out of that? Versus America is, doing all this fake regime change to get access to oil and oil pipelines. So this is awful what the United States has done and is continuing to do and is doing with Trump, and they did it under Obama and they did it under Bush. I mean, Clinton did a little bit of it. The first Bush did the first Iraq war. It's been pretty brutal. It's been pretty brutal. So, the title, I'm going to have to put dashes in the title and stuff like this because YouTube's going to try to demonetize this video for sure. So I'm going to the title's going to be like, Pentagon confirms Mosul, whatever. I got to come up with something. So thanks for watching, you guys, and thanks for supporting independent media like truthdig.com and the Political Vigilante. Patreon link is below. Show your support so we can do more. Boom.